Yeah, well, we try to calculate out the amount of money that it would increase, but it's very difficult to say. But of course, it would be like dollars per gallon that it would have an impact on. But what the bill actually said, well, they put together this working group to study the whole idea. But in the same bill, the idea was to reduce carbon emissions by 25% by 2030, 75% by 2040, and then 100% by 2050 compared to 2018 levels. And so, you're getting to zero there. But I mean, in that process, people are still buying gas and other liquid fuels. And of course, the price is going to go up on those as we go through time, because it becomes impossible for the fuel producers to make the fuel that clean.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. When you pull up to the pump to fill your gas tank, do you want the government to tell you what gas to choose? Or worse yet, do you want the government to charge you more for gas as a way of forcing you to drive less or pay more for an electric car? That is what some states are trying to do, calling them clean fuel standards, when in many instances the law doesn't make the environment any cleaner, but rather creates a tax on gasoline to discourage its use. In Minnesota last session, they attempted to introduce clean transportation standards that would impose new requirements on all fuels in the state. Now, due to a large and diverse coalition, the bill didn't make it out of committee. But with Minnesota's House split evenly between the two parties and committee leadership alternating weekly, this bill could make a return in the next session. What's more, other states are keeping a close eye on what Minnesota does because they could try to follow suit. Well, I want to welcome Kent Kaiser, who is with the Domestic Policy Caucus, as our guest today. Kent, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's talk about your organization a little bit and talk about that and what you focus on.
Sure. Well, with the Domestic Policy Caucus, we focus on what it sounds like, domestic policies, where we think that people would have an interest all across the country, actually, not just in Minnesota. We are based in Minnesota. And in this case, we actually set up a special organization, No Fuel Ban, because we were so concerned about what was happening in Minnesota and, in fact, across the country. Because like you said, we fear that this bad idea could take hold in other places. And it actually has taken hold in other states, especially in the Northwest.
Yeah, we see that happen all the time, whether it's on energy policy or other areas, tax policy or environmental things, where it'll pass in a state. People will think that's a good idea and then try and get it passed in a bunch of other states. You've created a website called nofuelban.com. Talk about that website. What's some of the information on the site, and why should people go to that?
Yes, we set up that site specifically for the clean transportation standard in Minnesota, but we've been watching all across the country, like I said, for other states and the bad idea taking hold elsewhere. And people can see exactly what the process was in Minnesota and what an extreme policy it really is. And the name of the policy sounds so nice, clean transportation standard. Right. Who's not for clean transportation? Right? But it is really way too extreme to have any practical value, especially in a state like Minnesota. And Minnesota's following in the footsteps of California, of course, as usual, and taking California's bad idea and putting it on steroids. Really, it's way worse than anything that even Californians could come up with. It's quite remarkable in that regard.
Yeah, and it really hurts people who can least afford it, right? I mean, fuel. These are people that work, every day for a living. There's people who, use their vehicle for their job, craftsmen, carpenters, laborers, people like that. These are the people that really are this is really going to hurt them more than it's certainly not going to hurt millionaires. They'll put whatever gas they need to or whatever fuel they need to in a vehicle. But these are the people that it really does hurt, right?
That's right. And that's why we were able to put together such a nice broad coalition of people to oppose this in the last legislative session. We had the Minnesota Trucking Association. We had, of course, those who have fuel, convenience stores and so on, and grocers and just, loggers, a whole coalition of people, because it really does affect those industries where fuel is so important. And in Minnesota, Minnesota is very agricultural overall. I would probably 2/3 of the state is agricultural.
Sure.
And so that's where it really hurts the most. And really this standard, if it were put into place, would harm people in rural areas from two directions, really. There's the obvious direction, which is, of course, higher cost of fuel. And of course, like you said earlier, trying to push people away from the internal combustion engine to having an electric vehicle. I mean, it's really a heavy-handed way. We think that people should have a choice, obviously. If people want to have an electric vehicle, fine. But to force them into it is really just too heavy-handed. But the other thing that we're really concerned about is, in Minnesota, and I know this has been true in other states too, we've spent billions of dollars, both private and public money, to develop, our ethanol industry and to create this sort of jobs economy in rural Minnesota for corn growers particularly, so that we would have these alternative fuels. And this clean fuel standard doesn't have any kind of carve out for that. And because those fuels are not carbon zero, they too would be, really jettisoned. And so we would be effectively flushing those billions of dollars down the toilet that we've been investing for decades into the. And so we would be putting those people out of work who have, of course, stake their whole livelihoods on the ethanol industry, and the whole rural economy is really kind of wedded to that. And so I think the people who represent urban areas don't really understand exactly how harmful a policy like this would be and how it would upend people's lives. And I think they also don't understand the limited sort of opportunities there are for people in rural areas. And so once you've built up an economy that's, largely devoted to ethanol and corn growing, and then you want to pull the rug out from under people who are devoted to that economy, well, you really create hardship and really there isn't another opportunity for people. It's not as though they live in an urban area where they can go down a street a few blocks or a couple miles and find a new job. That's just not the way it is in rural areas. And so we're really concerned about that, in addition to, of course, for everyone across the state, we would be concerned for the price of fuel going up by, great deal over the next 10 to 15 years. And eventually the idea would be to have 100% liquid fuel ban in the state by 2050, which really isn't all that far away. I mean,
right.
The lawmakers will talk about it as though it's so far away. But even with the working group that they set up on it, they had to alter their benchmarks and their goals for those benchmarks, because they realized pretty quickly that it would be impossible to reach the standards by 2030 and 2040 that they had set up. But they still have that 100% for 2050 of getting rid of carbon. So
yeah,
it will be impossible.
Yeah. Well, and this is I'll date myself a little bit by throwing this out there, but this, and I talked about this issue on a previous podcast episode, and I suggested that maybe these legislators who want to just pull this out of thin air and just decide that somehow we'll meet this fuel standard that we can't meet today by technology standards, why not just go put in the Jetsons model and say that we will just all drive the vehicles that they flew on the Jetsons cartoon, right? I mean, it's just as reasonable as this one.
It is. I mean, it's absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
And that's part of it too. And then the other thing, of course, is just the practicality. I mean, what you're talking about is absurd, of course, on the state, but I mean, it really is, from a practical perspective, just that absurd to think that everybody would be trying to get into an electric vehicle. And these policymakers often in the city they really aren't aware of what it's like in rural Minnesota, where it's sometimes 20 to 40 degrees below zero. Right. I mean, that's not uncommon for it to be 20 and 30 below zero in the morning in northern Minnesota, and to have to drive some distance to get to work, maybe a half hour, an hour you're driving, or to get your groceries or whatever it is. You really do have to drive that. I grew up in an area where people were bused in from an hour and 15 minutes drive away for school. And that's what people are doing each day for their jobs and for just, to get their basic necessities. And so they're driving a lot, for one thing, but they're also needing a very reliable vehicle all year long. And the electric vehicles just aren't there. And nobody really predicts that they're going to be there. And everybody talks about, those who do have electric vehicles will talk about how, my vehicle gets X amount of miles on a charge in the summer, and that's reduced by sometimes 75% or more in the winter when it's truly cold. Sure. I mean, people don't kind of get that. When you buy that, it's sort of like it's way different from gas mileage. I mean, when you know what your gas mileage is, you kind of have some idea that even if it's cold, you're probably going to be able to get a certain distance. But with electric vehicles, you really don't know. Well, they haven't been tested enough, and they aren't reliable enough. So
sure. And look, Kent, this is the whole problem is government is forcing this choice on people, exactly right? And they're making the decision for people. I would say this, that if you're a farmer and an electric vehicle made sense to you and to your business, you would make that choice. If it doesn't make sense, you're not going to make that choice. You're going to make a better choice for yourself, but you know better about the vehicle you need for your agriculture business or whatever business you're in, better than the government. And this is the government really trying to decide that for you. And that's why it's wrong. I mean, the free market ought to be deciding this. But let me ask you, what are the fuel standards now in Minnesota? And are they that much different than the states surrounding Minnesota now?
Well, I don't know what the states surrounding us are at the moment, honestly, but there are 17 states that have what's called a California exemption from the EPA's Clean Air Act. Mm-hmm. And that's because our standards in those 17 other states either follow California standards or have something even more rigid. Mm-hmm. Which is what we have in Minnesota already. Right. And in fact, if we just left everything as it is in Minnesota, we would have a 30% reduction in carbon with no cost to the consumers or the taxpayers. And so we're already making progress and of course, better than other states. And that's true with the other states that are considering this clean transportation standard kind of concept as well, is that they are among those 17 states, of course, like Washington and Oregon. You can imagine which states are sure. And surprisingly, though, there aren't any states east of Minnesota that have considered it so far. Now, I've gotten wind of a couple that may be considering it here in the future, but so far it's been western states that have been looking at this, Nevada and New Mexico and so on. And so it's a little surprising when you hear which states are actually considering it and which haven't. And we're kind of pleased that we haven't had to fight this battle anywhere on the East Coast yet, but the West Coast is, kind of got us locked up here with the crazy ideas of clean transportation standards. Yeah,
well, let's talk about clean transportation standards bill that was being considered in Minnesota. And you talked a little bit about this, about getting to zero emissions and all of that. But what would it have done to the fuel requirement in the state? And what would it have done, you think, to the fuel bill for people, driving automobiles?
Yeah, well, we try to calculate out the amount of money that it would increase, but it's very difficult to say. But of course, it would be like dollars per gallon that it would have an impact on. But what the bill actually said, they put together this working group to study the whole idea. But in the same bill, the idea was to reduce carbon emissions by 25% by 2030, 75% by 2040, and then 100% by 2050 compared to 2018 levels. And so, you're getting to zero there. But I mean, in that process, people are still buying gas and other liquid fuels. And of course, the price is going to go up on those as we go through time, because it becomes impossible for the fuel producers to make the fuel that clean. And so just it would go up. We figured 50 cents in the next, over what it would have been by 2030. And that's been borne out in other states. Washington State is one where they put in a clean transportation standard, and it went up by, they said, the people who are promoting the policy suggested that, the gas will go up by 1 cent a gallon. Well, it went up by 50 cents. So it was 50 times more than they claimed it would be. And so that's part of the problem too, is you don't get an honest answer when you ask policymakers what they think the cost of fuel would be. Yeah. And under this policy, I mean, they just lie. I suppose they just don't even know.
Right.
But we think that by 2040 or something, it would be $2 more per gallon in Minnesota, which it's just an incredible tax. I mean, just think of what, we have fluctuations in fuel prices over the years, and everybody kind of knows, like when the price of gas goes up by $1, that's painful. Yeah. People start making different choices about what they're going to do, and that's exactly the point of the hardship that they're trying to impose on people, trying to force them into making a different choice. Yeah,
and Kent, frankly, the arrogance. I mean, there's no other word to use than arrogance. The arrogance of someone, a policymaker or a head of a think tank that maybe makes $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 a year, saying it's only going to go up 50 cents a gallon or $1 a gallon or $2 a gallon. People, well, you can afford that maybe if you make $500,000 a year. It doesn't impact you. But most citizens don't make that. And it is completely arrogant for someone to make a statement like that, right? This should be something that we're driving down the costs of fuel as best we can to help people. That's the job of policymakers.
That's right. And that's not only the cost of the fuel, but there's also the cost of the vehicle. I mean, electric vehicles are not cheap. And most people I know, including myself, try and find a used vehicle.
Yeah.
You're not finding you don't even find electric vehicles on the used market for very little. I mean, they're still very, very expensive compared to a regular vehicle. And so, you're right. Arrogance is exactly the right word to describe what the policymakers are doing. And then I think it's cluelessness too. I mean, I don't know if there's a better word for it, but again, I think many policymakers are kind of cloistered in an urban area and don't understand what it's like to be someone who needs to use a vehicle for their work or to go long distances just to do basic day-to-day activities like taking the kids to soccer practice or hockey practice or going to get groceries or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. I think often of the people who, and, let's be honest, capital cities are generally in more urban areas, right? In most of our states. So if you think of legislators, a lot of times their daily life is, maybe within just, a couple of miles of that Capitol building. They can easily take an Uber or walk or ride a scooter or whatever. You don't ride a lot of scooters when you're out in the middle of Minnesota somewhere in a rural area. I mean, those are not things you can force onto other people, onto your constituents for very long before they revolt. And I think we see some of that sometimes, this revolt of citizens over this kind of stuff.
No, and that's right. And unfortunately, what we've got in Minnesota, and I know this is true in other states too, where our urban area, we have one big urban area in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. Right. And unfortunately, the population of the Twin Cities has grown to the point where it kind of can outvote the rural area. Mm-hmm. Now, every once in a while you get some common sense people who are in the suburbs who help. But I think that's the truth in many states at this point. It was where the urban area is growing so much compared to the rural area that those urban policymakers really have a lot more power than they used to, and can outpower the common sense kind of legislators from rural areas.
Yeah. Let's talk about this bill. It came up last session. Talk about what happened to the bill this last session.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, what they did was they put together this Clean Transportation Standard work group, and the work group got together from, in 2024 and then in 2023, and then in early 2024 presented this report to the legislature. And it was very interesting to watch this. First of all, it was a work group of 40 different people from all these different organizations from across the political spectrum, wide variety of, environmental groups, trade associations, industries. And as you can imagine, 40 people in a work group doesn't get much done. There's just too many people. It's impracticable. And so they had several meetings, but again, totally impracticable. And so what was happening, in fact, and I watched these meetings and because they were online, and what really happened, and you could tell that this was happening, that it was really bureaucrats who were calling all the shots, suggesting all of the policies, and then bringing them to the work group basically for approval. And when there were objections from anybody in the work group, those were just, they kind of gave lip service to listening to the objection, but then just kind of moved on and continued what the bureaucrats wanted in that final report. And it was a combination of bureaucrats from 4 different agencies, all of course under the governor's, under the governor's administration, from Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And what you saw when the work group was meeting was that there were a couple of voices that I think had outsized clout in putting together the policy prescriptions that wound up in the final report. And those, one in particular was a former commissioner who from an agency who was very liberal. And so you really didn't have, so the work group was, I don't know, what do you call it, window dressing?
Yeah.
Kind of, whatever, to make it seem as though that there was public input, but in fact there wasn't. What really helped us, we had our coalition, of course, we were there to oppose, and we made a lot of noise about it. And it was a broad coalition that we brought together to oppose it. But ultimately, what happened was that we were loud enough so that I think many legislators didn't have the stomach for pushing it forward in that last session, in March, April, May of this year, because they were facing an election here in November. And I think if it hadn't been an election year, man, we would have had a much more difficult time getting this pushed off, because that's all it's been done. It's just been pushed off to the future, I think. Now, as you mentioned in the introduction, we're fortunate now that the Republicans and Democrats are tied in our state house, but it's still a really precarious position to be in, because you have one who defects from common sense on the Republican side, and if you have all the Democrats hold together, and at this point the Democrats are mainly urban from Minnesota, and so if that happens, then some crazy idea like this could have legs in the next legislative session when they're not facing an election next fall. Yeah,
wow, that's crazy. You got a split House and sort of shared leadership in the House, a kind of a scary prospect.
We've had it before, and it is very strange.
Yeah.
You're right. Like every other week, one's sort of in charge, and it's better than what was happening last year. What made us so fearful last session was that the Democrats had both the Senate, the House, and of course the governorship, and so they really did push through a lot of policies that would have been, pretty objectionable, I would say.
Yeah.
and didn't have any checks on them at all.
Yeah.
But now at least there'll be a little bit of a check on them with this tied situation in the House.
Right. But in this coalition that you built in the last session, I mean, you had people from the left who also joined the coalition, right?
Oh, yeah. We had people who, you wouldn't necessarily consider to be, partisan at all.
Mm-hmm.
The retailers,
right.
And of course the trucking association. I mean, some of these, you never know where they might be politically, because some of them are sort of union oriented and some of them are sort of business oriented. And, we had the corn growers, and I mean, we had a really good coalition of people who we were working with, and some, it was interesting. I talked to a couple who didn't want to, were with us, philosophically, but wouldn't join us officially because they didn't even want their name attached to the concept. There was one particular who was actually on the Clean Transportation Standard work group, and he was totally with us, but would not agree to be part of the coalition because he was too afraid that just even being part of having his name attached to it, his members would really not be happy with him. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah,
they were there in spirit. And it was interesting going to the Capitol and testifying and seeing the people who were giving me pats on the back on the way out. They weren't necessarily part of the coalition, but they were all for what I was doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, hopefully your coalition, you've built upon your coalition, and it sounds like you have a little bit better environment in the legislature than you did last session. So hopefully if your coalition is better than it was, and stronger, and then you have a little of maybe a better chance with a split house, hopefully that can stave off this bill once again.
That's right. And again, we're poised to help in other states too, as we have with other policies. It just happened that Minnesota, which is where we are, was the ground zero for this last session. But if this comes up in other states, we're poised and ready to help there too.
Yeah. So if people want to learn a little bit more about what you're doing, where can they go?
Well, they can check out nofuelban.com or domesticpolicycaucus.com, either one. And they get a broad sense of the issues that we cover on that domesticpolicycaucus.com. And of course, if they're interested in the Clean Transportation Standard, as it's called, and our efforts on trying to avert fuel ban, they can go to nofuelban.com.
Yeah. And I would assume if somebody's listening to this podcast and they think this may be coming to their state, they could contact you and hopefully help some pointers on fighting this.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd be happy to talk to anybody where this is happening in their states. And again, we're poised to be able to help and give advice and be there actually and help. We've got networks all across the country to be able to fight this crazy idea wherever it pops up.
Yeah. Well, Kent, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, but also your fight on this issue. This is, you're fighting for the average person, right? I mean, the elites have their lobbyists out there who are working on things like this, but somebody's got to fight for the average person who can't afford an extra $1 a gallon on gas. And that's what you're doing. And just really want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You bet. All right, Kent, thanks so much. Look, this is just one of those things where sometimes elected officials and I would just call them elites get on one side of an issue and they just don't understand it. You see it sometimes with the environmental groups and labor unions, where environmental groups stop understanding what the average person is going through. And so there gets to be this tension there. And I think you're seeing that here with this standard in Minnesota and other states across America. So we've got to fight these sorts of things. Truly, it's about choice. It's about you making the individual choice. If you think that an electric vehicle is right for you, you should be able to make that choice. But if you think, a pickup truck that maybe costs $150,000 brand new, but gets, 40 miles to the gallon, if that's for you, that's great. But if you can't afford that and you want to buy a pickup truck for, $30,000 or $40,000 that maybe doesn't get quite that gas mileage, that ought to be a choice that you make. It shouldn't be the government imposing these decisions upon you. That's freedom. That's choice. And look, we talk about it all the time. Freedom has to be defended. Liberty and freedom have to be defended. And that's what Kent is doing here. It's what we do on this podcast, and hopefully it's what you do as well. Go out there, defend freedom, defend liberty. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.